Okay, Dr. Mallé, Fofana, commenting on the same topic points,
yes,
and then
yes, very quick on two things. I think one is when it's come to the GCF, I think we all see the pink elephant, and we have to be just really straightforward on that. You know, what we need is just having, you know, a lot of institutions that are really national in the driving seat when it's come to direct access entity to the GCF. Most of the money that we have from the different, let's say from the GCF implementing in country, sometimes it's led by international organizations that not really have footprint in a sense. Also, they rely heavily on national institutions. So what we can do in Africa, I think we can try to promote more having national organization, national financial institutions as accredited entity. So at least that will help us to see where the money will come from. And when it's channeled to the national entity, it will be easiest to channel to where it's really needed in terms of adaptation and other things that link to that. That's one thing. The second element also, it's really on how we can have more collaborative, you know, role and support when it's come to attract those finance. I think Kevin mentioned that part. I think the communication and the collaboration is key when you go for regional like approach, because some issues cannot be solved by one country. So we need to have a regional approach when it's come to attract more funding, but also coming with clear component and how we can solve the issues that happen in country B, but also country C and D will be involved in the process as well. So that collaborative actor is quite important, and that require a political conversation and also implicating the regional community organizations, right? Like ECOWAS, you know, like others in the region, to really go with that perspective. So I think country ownership is key. Ownership in a sense of, you know, driving the seat on the program, saying that we have a national program that can be adaptation fund, adaptation NAP program, they can be in the NDC, but we say all the investment should go through and align with this program. That's the ownership. The second, having national entity that are really direct access entity. So will be prioritized to the GCF. So those can tap on those money before the international organization tapping to. So I think that's probably a transition process, but I think those elements can be really important in being leveraged to increase more funding and having access to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is actually very useful. We have some, you know, specific suggestions on how to deal with the infamous 100 billion, okay, and talk about, you know, others as well from the suggestions. Anyone from our speakers want to add anything in this area before we move on to the self-finance as a key issue for Africa? Because so far, okay, Dr. Yasmin, go ahead.
I'm sorry that I have to jump in, but two things that it's a very interesting discussion. I know that they are commenting on what me and Kevin has been saying, but that's very interesting. And before I have to run to another meeting. Okay. Two things on what Mallé has mentioned here. I understand how the regional perspective is very important without looking only at one country benefiting from the intervention as related to climate, because climate has no boundaries. But here I would like also to say that there is an opportunity that we have, which has been declared by the African Union a month ago, which is the regional strategy for resilience and adaptation for Africa. And I see that as a big opportunity, because by having that strategy coming out from the African Union would show where would be the priorities at the regional level. We can take that and then start dividing that to sub-regional level, because that has been work that has been done, and see how can we match that with the existing fundings. And then from the sub-regional, there are countries that have already identified, or at least the framework of their NAPs, of their National Adaptation Plan, where are the national needs and ownership, and see how the matrix would go into the flow from regional, sub-regional into the national, and how that would match within the existing facilities of the financial mechanism. Also, Herry has mentioned that part related to the equity and the part related to the adaptation and the investment. I think that what has been there in providing technical assistance is very important, but it is not enough. So what kind of incentives that we can have for the private sector in order to understand the adaptation needs and how they get involved. Let me give a quick example in Egypt. When we have prepared our updated NDC with a need for 50 billion USD only for 2030 for the adaptation needs, one set of our priorities of what we call the NWAFI program were energy, food, and water nexus. And we put that together pretty well in a way saying that renewable energy would be the basis, that's where mitigation, but adaptation would be built on that through food and water that will be using that renewable energy. The part that we were able to include the private sector was related to the water desalination using renewable energy, where we have that costing of the investment of the private sector and how they can guarantee that and what kind of price that the country would have in order to buy the water from the private sector. That's a pure adaptation project related to water scarcity. Those kind of innovative ideas would bring that kind of, I know that Dr. Abla will be speaking about the blended finance, but that kind of a program, when we're talking about energy, when we're talking about food, which is agriculture as related to what kind of crops that we use, how can we involve the private sector, small credit line for the farmers, and then including the private sector in the water desalination. That's the kind of a package that would be attractive to everyone. Anyone would find his appetite: technical assistance, policy, investment, small credit line, technology, research, as well as the public funding. So I'm just gonna have to run to another meeting until we meet in the next webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. Abla, and all for fellow colleagues for giving that useful insights. And my colleagues are still there listening and interacting and taking notes so that we would be able to see you all in Sharm el-Sheikh, inshallah. Thank you, bye.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Yasmin. Really appreciate your interventions, and we love this discussion. I mean, I wish we could continue, but anyways, you are going to have a summary of everything that was said, and you are definitely going to be with us in every webinar. That's a promise. Yes. So no going back.
Yes, yeah, no, that's a promise. You know, I apologized last night, but I did confirm again, you know, and I have to run to the cabinet right now. I'll be there, even from far. You can rely on me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, say hi to all of them at the cabinet.
Okay.
Enjoy the meeting. All right. Okay. Let us move on from here and after those comments. And I was going to start talking about the ability of Africa to self-finance, but I'm debating whether to start with this or to start with the country experiences, because as I was talking to our colleague here, Mr. Andrew Alli, okay, he said I would talk on the two issues because they're actually interrelated, okay? And even as we are talking about those big global issues, we had to go into the countries and the national level and how the national institutions need to be at the driving seat. So it's about countries. Now that Dr. Yasmin mentioned the regional strategy that's being prepared by the African Union, I'm personally starting to have allergies in relation to all strategies, okay? Because the strategies, the big things, when you get into the specifics of the countries, you find that the countries are different and have their specificities, and these are not necessarily taken into consideration at the regional level. So things become a bit more complicated. So let me ask Mr. Andrew Alli to talk about a bit about the specifics of the countries, of the solutions that exist at the level of the countries, and how this can help lead to our big hope of having Africa finance itself someday. So Mr. Ali, go ahead, please. Mr. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abla. It's a big topic, and it's hard to know exactly where to start. But I will start with maybe a little sort of anecdote, which is that you know, a lot of people talk about the golden rule. And when people hear the golden rule, I think they think about, you know, do unto others what you want others to do unto you. But for me, actually, the golden rule means the following, you know, it's he who has the gold makes the rules. And that's why I believe that, you know, having your own financing is very important, because you cannot have your own national strategy without having some kind of baseload of your own financing to drive that. Now, as you've said, each country is different, and each country has its own needs and priorities. I think it's important also to bear in mind that countries cannot develop without having access to plentiful and cheap energy. And that most countries in Africa, not all, but most countries in Africa are far below the level of energy access that is needed for development. And while, as has been said in the introduction, you know, climate does affect Africa disproportionately. Unfortunately, you know, development is another one of our problems. And therefore, you know, each country needs to think about how to balance what it's doing around climate with its own development aspirations. I also believe that as of today, it's, you know, given our level of technology, it's very hard for countries to move to a completely sort of renewable energy solution due to the intermittency and the lack of storage. I think, you know, for example, there was a point where Kenya actually had so much renewable energy that it was becoming difficult, to, you know, relative to baseload, that it was becoming a bit difficult to manage the grid in a sort of cheap and efficient manner. So I think that these are some of the considerations that need to be taken into account. The other thing that afflicts, sadly, many African countries is that there isn't, there isn't a grid. So in many countries, sort of less than 50% of people actually have access to the grid. Which means that, you know, a lot of off-grid, mini-grid type of solutions can be useful. And, you know, this actually plays into the strengths of some of the renewable energy solutions like solar and wind to some extent. But it also means that sort of large-scale grid-based solutions are difficult. And this is compounded somewhat by the fact that in many African countries, the off-taker from the grid, namely the national utility, is tend to be, frankly, insolvent, and therefore very hard to lend to because they're not themselves credit-worthy. And a lot of time, effort, and money is spent actually navigating around the lack of bankability of national utilities in various countries. So again, different types of solutions would be needed to take into account these factors. And this is why I think self-financing, before I go into that, the other thing I think broadly around climate finance, which is not maybe directly related to net zero targets and things like that, is that it's important, in my view, for African countries to look at the new economy that is coming around climate and figure out how they can position themselves to take advantage of that. For example, I don't think that there are many companies in Africa that are in the battery value chain, despite the fact that actually many of the raw materials for those batteries EVs and other things to do with solar energy and electrical power actually come from within Africa. Now, I do know that there are initiatives. I think there's one that's happening with Afreximbank, which is based in Cairo, as you know, to try and develop this. But I'm not sure there are any major companies doing that yet. I think forestry is another area that, you know, certain African countries should take. Now, I don't have the exact numbers, but I believe that if you actually take the negative value of the forests that Africa has and combine that with the low carbon emissions already that we produce, that, you know, we're actually probably not too far away from some sort of net zero already. And, you know, I think that that should be taken into account. And I think that we should look at how to do two things. You know, one is how to get credit and financing to essentially plant more forests or reforest areas that have become deforested, because as far as I'm aware, today, forestry is perhaps the only real, you know, negative carbon thing, even though there are some carbon capture technologies out there. You know, but I think forestry is really the only negative carbon thing that is, you know, somewhat cost effective. And then I think that there's also an opportunity cost of not cutting down trees, especially given that, you know, many African countries are in a developmental state. And therefore, you know, some sort of compensation for actually not cutting down trees, essentially an opportunity cost, you know, is something that should be sought. The other two things I would say are, one, that, and this is what a lot of people don't focus on, is the cost, time, and expertise of developing projects. So it's all very well to say, okay, you know, we want to develop you know, 1 gigawatt solar farm, but, you know, somebody has to go through the process of doing all the permitting, the planning, getting the environmental studies done, negotiating the power purchase agreements, et cetera, et cetera. This costs money, this takes time, this requires expertise, and those things are not really readily available on the African continent, which again means that, you know, the projects are very often developed, or at least, you know, a lot of the input into the development is taken up by other people, and therefore those projects may not be optimal. So thinking around how to develop projects, and again, organizations like Africa 50 are focused on this, but, you know, I think that more can be done. And I think that that is very important within the whole, you know, figuring out what your energy mix needs to be and how you can go forward. I think the final point is, and again, you know, there are things around Africa already that focus on these things, but we need to, I think, up our game, is around providing credit guarantees. So as I mentioned, a lot of the utilities that would be off-taking power are not bankable. And there's a, I mean, there's a big debate about, you know, how people perceive project risks in Africa. And, you know, a lot of people would say that, you know, the risks are exaggerated, and to some extent, there's some evidence to show this. For example, Moody's every year produce a study which shows the, you know, the events of default in infrastructure projects in different regions. And that study consistently shows that the lowest defaults are in the Middle East, and the next lowest defaults are in Africa. And funnily enough, one of the highest regions for defaults is actually the North America. But you know, so there's maybe a gap in between perceptions and reality. But at the end of the day, a lot of the people who are bringing in this finance, you know, perception is reality for them. And therefore, having organizations that can provide credit guarantees, potentially partial credit guarantees, to assuage some of these people of some of these risks, I think will also help to accelerate funding coming into these regions. Now, all of these things are reasons why having some degree of self-financing or the ability to self-finance is very important. You know, you're very unlikely to get a large quantum of offshore financing for things like project development. You need to have some financing to take control of all the various elements that I've said. And unfortunately, financing is low in Africa, driven, I think, by ultimately by our low savings ratio. So if you look at the total savings in countries as a proportion of GDP, and by savings, I'm talking not just about individual people's savings, but also from the corporate sector and the government sector. The average for East Asia, the sort of developing parts of East Asia is 41% of GDP. The average for Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa is 23%. And to take some specific countries, Egypt, it's 11%, Kenya, it's 15%, and Nigeria, it's 29%, whereas China is 44%, and many of the fast-growing East Asian countries land somewhere between 35% and 40%. So you know, it's imperative that we really focus on driving sort of national savings and investment cultures, and things like sovereign wealth funds are a step in this direction. And you know, obviously Uche is with the Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and over the last few years, a number of countries have you know, started up sovereign wealth funds, and you know, these sovereign wealth funds are often taking initiatives in various important areas. Things also like pension reform are important to drive individuals saving into pensions. And if you know, I mentioned the number of 29% for Nigeria. This used to be 12–15%, but the start of a national pension industry is what's driven it up, at least partially, to the 29%. Obviously, these sort of fundamental reforms take some time, and sort of before those happen, it's useful for African governments to, and also I think it's important for us to work together as well, as Dr. Abla said. And I mean, I was pleased to see that all the, or not all, but a lot of the sovereign wealth funds in Africa and the Middle East actually got together, I think it was in Morocco, some time ago, to start a process where they cooperate with each other. Yeah, so those are my thoughts on those two individual topics.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andrew. Very interesting and a wide variety of suggestions. Going back to your quote that who has the gold makes the rules, I want to ask Dr. Mallé Fofana to say, how do we get the gold? How do we get the gold? How do we play this game? We need the gold badly.
We can make the rules.
I think we have more than goals, I think, to make the rules. So let me share my screen so that can be very quick on that one. Let me know your screen if it's
yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Good, very good. So I think very briefly, maybe nobody's know who's GGI. I want to just couple of slides on who we are. We are a Global Green Growth Institute. We are placed as a treaty-based organization and organize support countries on the green economy and green growth model. So we are supporting our partner through the SDC, NDC as well, and help countries to really, achieve the sustainable development goals to project program that we're supporting globally. Of course, we also had a chance to work in the different value chains when it's come to green impact assessment from, development of economic growth and sustainable diagnostics through financing and designing project and policy. So we have that value chain that help us really to start from the basic when it's come to support country on the transformation to the implementation. And we focus on a couple of sectors like solar energy, forestry, green buildings, sustainable transport. We have a team focusing on green investment, which is the key topics that we discuss today, but also on carbon pricing unit. That's one of the points that we mentioned as a key solution when it's come to work on this sector.
We'll have you participate in the session on carbon, and you talk about the carbon then. Just
okay.
Sorry for the interruption.
It's okay. So we are about 43 members country, and we have also presence in Africa. We have a footprint in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda, Rwanda, that we support on country on that particular things. So to respond to your question, what I would like to do is really to set the scene. So there's things that I think will be good to come back a little bit and just see how these things change and how these things happen in a certain way. And the only way probably to understand that is to really look at the different, let's say, development sequences from the developing country and the developing country, mostly in Africa, so they can give us a really understanding on that. So what's happening is that on the developing country side, they have the really time to readjust the sequence on the stages by starting really on poverty elevation, where they go with a couple of that will go for the high rural urban migration, low per capita income, below infrastructure investment as well. And that create a lot of inadequate access to infrastructure, social basic as one, going on the poverty elevation as the first phase of their development. And from there, they move to industrialization, as we all know, right? And in that industrialization phases, what's happened is those countries that they really prioritize economic growth over environmental management, right? And that create a lot of issues when it's come to, air pollution, water pollution that we're seeing in now. And that happened, since, quite a decades from that perspective. Now they get also now on the third stages, which is the mass production and consumption, right? Which is mostly on how we can push more prospective lifestyle based on mass production, this consumption, large scales of pollution and waste, right? And the certain things. So they really have the time to move those phases in terms of development and have the time to readjust and have, in and out, models, in and out also plan and strategy to solve the issues on the growth from the different A to C as well. Now, when you go to the sense of developing countries, and most of them in Africa, our dilemma is different. We have the different sequences. This is normally the normal sequences. But the problem at this stage is that we ask Africa at this stage to not really go on that particular one, but also how they can combine that three phases as one due to time constraint, right? Because they want to expedite the development, want to expedite the industrialization, and also go to the mass production and consumption, which is mean of what? And I think I can add at this current point that we have also the triple crisis with this COVID-19, conflict and climate as well. So what is happening is that most of the country, they currently use one specific plan or one specific solution that was used by developing country, by developed country to solve poverty elevation, and use that solution in order to solve the current status, which is not possible in a sense, right? So what it means is that the countries need to have a well-integrated solution that can solve the three problems at the same time when it's come to industrialization, mass production, and poverty elevation, but also integrated that climate and COVID-19 situation as well. What does it mean for us? It means that we have to consider what we call the mitigation side with the low carbon economy, right? How we can emphasize higher resource productivity, but also fewer natural resources and less pollution. That's one solve one linked to industrialization in a certain way. The second, it's linked to the adaptation, what I will call it the concept of resilient society, is how we can have human in nature become more relevant and social as well in terms of the designing and developing a program, which is mean that the fact of having a well-integrated strategy at the national level can help really to solve that triple, let's say, issues in terms of phasing development, but also it's really well important at this stage for countries to have such things. That's why we have what we call the green growth strategy that is really important for country to have. And when we look at the green growth strategy, we have the low carbon economy in a sense, right? But also you also have what we will call this resilient society that go for how we can be efficient and sustainable resources we can use, right, in a certain way, but also how we can have a green economy opportunity that when we call about green investment, green trade, employment, and innovation. At the same time, we talk about also the social inclusion, which is quite important, and the natural capital protection that the minister mentioned about native-based solution as well. So that well-integrated, let's say, approach in the program can help country to be really robust and really being sitting in the comfort, element by also solving the issues when it's come to mitigation at the same time, as well as adaptation at the same time. So that's the complexity of the situation that we have now when it's come to at the current stage we are in the developing country and what need to be done in a certain way. So when we go now in details on the climate action and the cost need, right? So we look at that global, and I think Kevin mentioned that part, I will just focus now just on the NDC 1, which is the commitment of the countries when it's come to support fighting against climate change. We talk about $2.3 trillion, right? Needed between 20 and 2030, but it's kind of like average of like 250 billion per year. It's the equivalent of all Africa countries together in GDP. It's about 2.4 trillion. So it's like really a lot when it's come to investment. But it's what is really good to understand here is that we look at public climate commitment, which is quite low, right, on those countries, right? And the others, when it's come to private sector, really high. But the issue is that the private sector has significant potential to meet the Africa climate finance need. But when it's come to NDC conversation and discussion, they rarely discuss its role of the private sector in, right? So that's really important to consider that part. The other things that we can go is just look at how the finance flow to adaptation in Africa, right? We see there's a lot of things that go to, we thought about 30 billion adaptation was tracked, but also we have 6 billion go to Africa. But when we look at the 6 billion that go to the Africa, 90% are grant and concessional debt. And the public spending alone cannot meet the adaptation finance gap. So it's mean, again, private sector have a key role to play on that. And we need to know how the public sector can use the public finance as a leverage to increase more funding linked to climate in certain way. And that require a lot of things that link to budget tracking, climate finance tracking, to have the right system to know exactly how much they spend on the public sector that link to climate. So it's mean also the mainstreaming resilience investment, also enabling environment for adaptation and deploy innovative financial instrument is part of the solution. But when we look at also the climate flow, when I say this, it's really mainly financed by debt, right, for MDBs and grant. We need to just diversify our source of finance, right? Because as a debt instrument potentially worsen the debt position in Africa, we know that grant will not be sufficient in certain way, and also will not help the long-term planning and climate action. So innovative solution, diversifying our source of finance is quite important, and the self-financing thing is quite also relevant at this stage. How we can use our own asset, right, to have more leverage to finance the NDC or adaptation or NAP, National Adaptation Plan, for our green growth strategy. That will come as also, that's, the green development when it's come to COVID-19, we will go past you very quickly, but there's some recommendation on the green growth strategy that how we can just, apply, green stimulus priorities, go on solar power irrigation that link to the nexus water, food, and agriculture. Go also with the phasing out or transition when it's come to fossil fuel as well. So those can be used also as a point. But the key point that I really would like to emphasize here is that most of the financial instrument are not really adept to support our SMEs. And we know that our SMEs account for 60% of jobs in Africa, and we have about 40 million companies in Africa. So what does mean that we designed financial instrument that are not really hitting the target. So it's just focusing on less SMEs and also the informal sector that are really driving our economy. So the financial instrument that already exists, the financial system that already exists is not really tailored in our champions, or I will call it the SMEs. So we have to look at the best way we include the champions, but also what about the smallholder farmers in certain way. So it's good also to integrate that financial gap, but also how we can bring that gap in a certain way. So three things that need to be understood: the better design and the policy. Of course, it's about having the right strategy, having the right incentive. I think Alli mentioned that in terms of investment to promote the scales. Having a better project, right, that can have the risk reward expectation of investors, right? And I think the risk point is quite important. And when we will talk to the self-financing, one of the things that can help us instrument is also having a credit guarantee as well. And having a strong institution that not only on the driving the implementation of the program, but also designing or managing the asset of the country when it's come to self-financing. But when you look at on the country specific, right, we know that the country ability to mobilize financing, they have some disparity as well, right? We have macro factors, I will call, which is the investment that link to political stability, regulatory, which is really common. But we have some micro factors, right, that include project proposal and bankable project, right, which is require having in-house expertise to really have the climate rational, speak the same language with the investors, and come up with the right solution. The second is the financial mechanism, not only relying on external financial mechanism, how in a country you can have a financial mechanism to mobilize climate finance. Some countries start with national financial vehicle or their own guarantee facility or such kind of, let's say, innovative transition on that, and also engage private sector on climate change. And also the collaborative aspect is quite important on the strategic partnership, innovative as well as finance mobilization. So there is a progress, I would say, and admit on that. But I think there is also room to go on national climate fund, accreditation of entity, coordination mechanism, bond issues, and leverage natural asset as well. To unlock the climate finance, I will go through very quickly. We talk about blending finance, right? To consider finance, we talk about replication and upscaling, right? Because the aggregation problem approach a significant model to increase the flow of climate funding. So when you deal something that works very well, how you can upscale it, how you can replicate it in another region. Greening the financial sector, right? Private sector, especially the private financial institution, are reluctant to be in that climate sector, but also climate change is the business. They have to see it as a business, and it is the business in a sense, right? We can talk about the carbon pricing, right? How they can mobilize large volume of private capitals by going to link to the NDC, but also setting up certain partnership that link to that. So very quickly, this is the kind of instrument that you will see, come on the depth, right? But when you look at the depth in a sense, right, currently what's happening is that we have 22 countries in Africa that either in the debt stress or high risk on the debt stress, right? This means that the African government are struggling to pay debt that they incur on behalf of their states. We have example of countries like Mozambique or Zimbabwe already in that debt distress, or other high risk that we have in Malawi, Zambia, and Comoros. So it's mean that we have to look at the way that we can, use, for example, some instrument that they can be used as a self-financing, not using that one. I go more in detail on that, but also working on the green window to go on the blending finance, which is, Green Climate Fund, GEF, or Adaptation Fund. So what is the source of self-financing resources, right? And I will start with the enabling environment. So I think what is really fundamental is really how you can have economic growth that is a fundamental condition required to develop activities based on the generation of domestic resources. And Africa is making respectable progress, I can say, over the past 20 years. But there is a room of improvement. That's one thing. How we can have economic growth, but also I would say green economic growth. The second, how you can push for domestic saving. I think Ali mentioned that part because the private domestic in Africa is really low and the continent is underbanked. And it's quite important how we can push that further as well. The third is just linked to the tax revenue and tax administration. We have a good potential to create more domestic from efficient tax administration system. it's not about increasing the tax rate, but focusing more expanding the tax basis, right? That create more, solution for that particular things. So when we look at these things, when we look at the self-financing potential in Africa, what is mean for us? One thing is just, we know that Africa raised more than 520 billion annually from domestic tax against 59 billion that we receive from private flow and 50 billion for ODA. It's a big potential for tax revenue if the tax administration could be improved, but some factors need to be addressed, of course, right? So we have the high level informal employment, you have the Business Africa prevent the registration and the payment of the tax, but most of the economic activities, you have the low level income of even amongst those who are formally registered, decrease the basis. So tax administration capacity also are really limited and need also to be support to help them to really collect the revenue, even from the formal and registered economic transaction. That's one thing. The second aspect is linked to the pension fund, right? The size of the pension fund is really growing in Africa, right? We collectively manage like around 250 billion asset in sub-Saharan Africa. So how we can use that? What is the leverage of that? The asset is really important in certain way, but I think I would say, again, it's relatively small in the term of global term, but really big to support that transition as well. The pace and the direction that currently the Africa is taking is really good because we have the common purpose of funding retirement, contribution to development of continent economy and capital market. We have also the pension fund also on the continent are beginning to build environmental and social governance as principle into the investment criteria, which is quite good. The third one is just remittance. Sometimes we just not talked about it, but I think we are recording like 43 billion in 29 and 37 billion in 2020 when it's come to receiving funding from the diaspora. But the question is how we can implicate the diaspora and remittance, because we know that Africa can raise between 5 billion to 10 billion annually when it's come to remittance. So there's something that we can look at also for self-financing. The stock market capitalization, which is quite important. We have to push more regional and well-integrated stock market exchange, right? We raised just 300 billion from that period of 2016 to 1.3 trillion for now. So we have to push for more bonds. Bank would have a lot of liquidity, but sometimes have difficulty to lend. We have to go for sovereign wealth fund to be increased as well, so they can integrate that part of this. So I think it's quite important to consider that part. Private equity market is worth about 30 billion, but the private equity fundraising is about 1.2 billion for Africa private equity. It's mean that it's really low. How we can have more private equity owned by Africa? This is quite important because that's also say that the fundraising for global private equity is about 100 billion compared to 1.2 billion for Africa private equity. So there's a lot to do when it's come to do supporting that part. And lastly, it's about the illicit financial flow. How we can support countries to really, let's say, manage and attract and grab that financial flow. Because when we look at those countries, the total of illicit capital flow from Africa amount, it's about 800 billion compared to Africa total external debt, about 700 billion. This makes Africa a net creator to the world. Even we just trying to get these things done and trying to really support on that one. So we lost, I would say, about 9.6 billion as tax event, equivalent of 2.5 of tax total revenue in Africa because of that illicit thing. So how we can, let's say, support more in maintaining that one. So that we can push us a range, like kind of solution for self-financing. And that can go from, let's say, debt for climate watch that we just mentioned, right? How we can use our debt to swap it for the climate investment. We talk about the diaspora bond. Some countries tried, and Ethiopia tried as well, that part. Infrastructure bond, I'm sure that my colleagues, Kevin, will be agreeing on that part.
Yeah.
We talk about the green bonds.
Yeah, there will be more on that. Thank you. Extremely interesting, but I need you to wrap up for that.
Yeah, that's my last slide.
Okay.
That's my last slide. So you have about the green bonds that we quite important, I think, and sovereign wealth, sovereign pension fund, bond market, and regional stock exchange, right? So what it means is that with those type of self-financing, you need to have the government that should pursue the governance reform. You should have a platform for regular consultation for continental level as well. but also having lead institution and regional economic communities like, African Union, NEPAD, and IFDB and UNECA to really also pursue that direction they already have when it's come to support the country on that one. So these instruments can go more and more deeper, and we can have specific one that can be at the regional or national level, but it's worth exploring because the potential is here for Africa. And I can urge, countries to push for that. And we, as GGI, for example, we start the first green bond about 5 billion that we already launched, and also helping country to set up these sovereign pension fund or create a guarantee facility. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is extremely interesting and extremely useful, and it's actually a roadmap to how to get the goal. And obviously, getting the goal is not easy. To be the one with the goal, then make our own decisions. It's not easy. It's a difficult road. Okay, some of it is related to the finance and a lot of money that we can collect if we improve our systems, but most of it is in the growth part, in the green growth part, which means SMEs' ability to produce and readiness for having projects ready and having the bank system that is ready. Okay? There are a lot of core issues there.